The excavator's engine cut off mid-turn. "Follow me, hurry." One by one, down the line, the machines went quiet. Then so did the men standing beside them. Boots stopped moving. Radios stopped chirping. Nobody spoke. Marcus Bellamy spun around, his tablet still glowing with site plans, to find an old man standing directly in the path of 11 tons of steel. Work boots caked in dried mud, a walking stick worn smooth by decades of use. Eyes that hadn't blinked since he started shouting. "Sir, you need to step back," the foreman called out. "This is an active construction zone." The old man didn't move. "Please," he said, quieter now, almost breaking. "Before it's too late." Behind him, the site stretched out in every direction. Fresh tractor tracks pressed into dry ground, orange survey flags fluttering in a hot wind, dust still hanging in the air where the excavator had kicked it up moments before. It looked, for all the world, like nothing worth stopping for. Marcus glanced at his watch. 312 acres, $42 million. A signed contract, a groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for 9 sharp. And now a stranger standing in his dirt like he owned it. "Who are you?" "Wendell Cross," the man said. "I farmed this land for 60 years before you bought it out from under me. Give me 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Something in the way he said it, not pleading, not angry, just certain, made Marcus lower his tablet. 10 minutes, Marcus said. "Crew, take a break." The workers didn't cheer, and they didn't joke the way crews usually do during an unplanned pause. They just watched the old man turn toward the tree line at the edge of the property, his stick tapping against sun-baked earth, and something about his pace, urgent but careful, like a man crossing a minefield, kept every single one of them exactly where they stood. If stories about forgotten history, quiet courage, and the secrets buried beneath ordinary ground keep you watching until the very end, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop a like if that opening already has you leaning in, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Wendell led Marcus past the surveyor's stakes, past the flags marking where the first retention pond would go, toward a line of old, gnarled trees that the site plan simply labeled "Vegetation Clear." "Those trees," Wendell said, stopping in their shade, "are not decoration." Marcus looked up. The trees were nothing special to look at. A ragged row of hackberry and Osage orange, twisted and half dead in places, running in a crooked line across what would soon be a parking structure. "They're in the way of Phase 1, Marcus said. "I already cleared this with the county. The county doesn't know what's under them. And you do." "My grandfather planted this row in 1936, Wendell said. "You know what that year means out here?" Marcus knew the number, but not what it meant. "Depression era." "Dust Bowl," Wendell corrected. "You ever seen footage of it? Sky black at noon, topsoil blowing clean off the fields, burying fences, burying trucks, burying whole houses. My grandfather lost 2 crops in a row to wind he couldn't see coming until it swallowed the horizon. He ran a hand along the nearest trunk, rough bark catching against his palm. Government men came through offering seedlings, said if farmers planted trees in long rows, breaking up the wind, the soil would stay put. Most men round here laughed at it, said trees don't stop a duster. My grandfather planted anyway. Whole shelter belt, 1/4 mile long, right here. That's a nice story, Marcus said, checking his watch again. But I don't see how a windbreak from 90 years ago changes anything about today. Wendell's jaw tightened. Because underneath that windbreak is the only thing keeping half this valley's wells from running dry. Marcus stopped scrolling. What do you mean, underneath it? But Wendell had already started walking again, deeper into the trees, and this time, Marcus followed without being asked. They came to a low rise in the land, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A gentle swell of earth covered in wild grass and clover, with a scattering of flat stones half buried in the dirt. "What is this?" Marcus asked. "Kneel down," Wendell said. "Brush the grass back on that stone there." Marcus hesitated, then crouched and pulled aside a clump of clover. Beneath it, worn nearly smooth by weather, was a shape carved into limestone. A name, most of the letters gone. A date, only half legible. 1867. "That's a grave, Mr. Bellamy," Wendell said quietly. "There's 11 more just like it, scattered under this rise. The Whitfield family, freedmen who came to this valley the year after the war ended, when land like this was finally theirs to work and eventually theirs to buy. They cleared this ground by hand, dug the first wells, buried their own when fever came through, in the winter of '69. Nobody wrote it in any history book, nobody but the families who stayed. Marcus stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees, his earlier confidence noticeably thinner. "There's nothing in the property records about a cemetery," he said. "I had a full title search. Environmental survey. Nothing flagged this." "Because nobody flagged it," Wendell said. "By the time the last Whitfield descendants moved north in the 1940s, the county had lost track. No headstones tall enough to see from a road, no fence, just families who remembered, quietly, and made sure nobody plowed it under. Families like yours. My grandfather knew the Whitfields, grew up alongside their grandchildren, right here on this ground. When he planted that windbreak, he didn't just plant it for the soil." Wendell's voice caught, just slightly. "He planted it around this rise on purpose. Said as long as the trees stood, nobody would ever forget where the graves were, even after everyone who remembered was gone." For the first time since the machines had gone quiet, Marcus didn't have anything practical to say. "Why didn't you tell me this before I signed the sale?" he finally asked. "Before any of this?" "I tried, twice," Wendell said. "Wrote to your office myself. Got a letter back calling it an unverified oral history claim, insufficient for delaying the transaction timeline. I still have it at home, if you want to read your own company's words." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Not quite guilt, not quite anger, something in between. I never saw that letter. It never crossed my desk." "I believe you," Wendell said. "That's why I'm standing in front of your excavator instead of calling a lawyer." Marcus turned back toward the crew, now clustered near the equipment, watching from a respectful distance. He noticed something he hadn't before. Several of them weren't looking at him. They were looking at the trees, at the rise of grass, murmuring low. "Boss," the foreman called out, "my grandmother's people are from 3 counties over. She always said there were unmarked graves scattered through this whole valley, from back when land got passed hand to hand, and nobody kept proper paper on it. I never thought much of it till right now." "You knew about this?" Marcus asked. "Not this spot, just that it happens out here, more than people admit." Marcus turned back to Wendell. "Say I believe every word of this. Say the graves are real. That still doesn't explain what you said about the wells." Wendell nodded, as if he'd been waiting for the question. "Follow me one more time." They walked past the rise, down a shallow slope Marcus hadn't noticed on any site plan, to a spot where the ground turned faintly darker, damper, even in the dry heat of morning. A ring of stones, mostly collapsed, sat half swallowed by grass. "Spring house," Wendell said. "Built by the Whitfield men themselves, stone by stone, over a natural spring that never once ran dry. Not during the Dust Bowl. Not during the drought of '88. Not during the one we're having right now. That spring feeds groundwater that recharges 9 wells across this valley, Mr. Bellamy, including the municipal well that supplies water to 1,100 people in town. That's not on any map I've seen, because the spring was never surveyed properly. My grandfather knew where it was because the Whitfields showed him. He knew the shelter belt's roots helped hold the surrounding soil together, kept it from washing straight into the spring and choking it with silt during heavy rain. Cut those trees, grade this land the way your plans call for, and you don't just disturb some old graves." Wendell's voice dropped lower. "You cut off the water underneath your own development and everyone downhill from it, all 9 wells at once." Marcus stared at the ring of collapsed stones, doing math he didn't want to do. "Our environmental report said groundwater levels were stable, because whoever wrote that report tested wells a half-mile off, where the aquifer's deeper and slower to react. They never tested here, because here isn't on record as anything worth testing. You're telling me $42 million of planning missed a hand-dug well from the 1860s. "I'm telling you," Wendell said, "that some of the most important things on a piece of land were never written down anywhere official. They were just remembered, carefully, by people who cared more about the truth than the paperwork." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out over ground that, an hour ago, had been nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet. "Why does this matter so much to you personally?" he asked. "You sold the farm. You could have let this be someone else's problem." Wendell's grip tightened on his walking stick. "My grandfather made me a promise keeper before I understood what that meant," he said. "Told me, 'Wendell, Land remembers longer than people do, but only if somebody keeps reminding it. I'm 78 years old. I don't have many more mornings left where I can walk out here and stand watch over this place. He looked toward the crew, toward the machines, toward the whole enormous weight of the project waiting behind them. I wasn't about to let the last thing I did on this land be nothing. Marcus looked down at the collapsed stones of the spring house, then up at the crooked old windbreak still standing after 90 years of wind it was never supposed to survive. What happens now, he said slowly, isn't really up to a contract anymore, is it? No, Wendell said. It's up to you. The silence stretched, broken only by wind moving through the hackberry leaves overhead. The same trees that had stood since before either of the men speaking beneath them were born. Marcus finally turned to his foreman. Pull the crew off this section. All of it. Radius of at least 200 yards from the rise and the spring. Boss, that's going to cost us weeks. I don't care about that right now, Marcus said. Get me the County Historical Society on the phone and find out who I need to call about a conservation easement. Wendell exhaled, something in his shoulders finally loosening, as if he'd been holding his breath for longer than the last 10 minutes, maybe for years. That night, back at his office, Marcus dug through an old filing cabinet his assistant hadn't touched in months, until he found it. A single-page letter from Wendell Cross, dated over a year earlier, stamped received, and stapled to a form response denying any delay. He read it twice, then set it down, and didn't sleep much. It took the better part of 8 months to do what should have taken a matter of weeks, back when the plan had simply been to clear, grade, and build. The cemetery was properly surveyed, mapped, and fenced. A historian working with the county traced descendants of the Whitfield family scattered as far as Detroit and Toronto, several of whom returned for the first time in 80 years to see where their ancestors had been laid to rest. A small stone marker was placed at the edge of the rise, funded jointly by Marcus's company and the county, listing the names historians could recover and honoring those they couldn't. The spring house was restored by a team of preservationists, its stones reset the way the original builders had laid them. Hydrologists confirmed exactly what Wendell had described: an aquifer recharge zone feeding 9 wells across the valley, the municipal supply among them, previously unmapped and unprotected by any existing regulation. The development plan changed. Phase 1 shifted 200 yards east. The shelter belt stayed exactly where it had stood for 90 years, now protected under a permanent conservation easement instead of a clearing order. A small interpretive trail was added along its length, with markers explaining the Dust Bowl, the science of windbreaks, and the families, remembered and unremembered, who had shaped this land long before anyone thought to build on it. One of Wendell's grandfather's old ledgers, found in a trunk in the farmhouse attic, turned out to hold decades of handwritten spring flow measurements, a rough but remarkably accurate record that helped hydrologists confirm just how steady the water source had remained, drought after drought, for nearly a century. The County Historical Society had it copied and archived. On the day of the unveiling, a woman in her 60s stood near the front of the small crowd, holding a folder of yellowed photographs against her chest. Her name was Dolores Whitfield Grant, and she had driven 11 hours from Detroit after a phone call from the county historian she almost hadn't answered. "My great-great-grandmother is one of the names on that stone," she told Marcus quietly, before the ceremony began. "Nobody in my family knew exactly where she was buried. We just knew she'd come south from nothing and built something here, and that it got lost somewhere along the way." She opened the folder. Inside was a photograph, brittle at the edges, of a spring house, the same ring of stones Wendell had led Marcus to months earlier, only whole this time, roofed, with 2 men standing proudly beside it. "My grandfather kept this his whole life," she said. "Never told me exactly where it was. Just said, 'Somewhere back home there's water we built with our own hands.' I never thought I'd stand in front of it." Marcus looked at the photograph, then at the restored spring house behind them, stone for stone the same. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "I'm sorry nobody found this sooner." "Somebody did," Dolores said, glancing toward Wendell. "He just had to shout loud enough for the right person to finally stop and listen." Wendell was there the day the marker was unveiled, leaning on his walking stick beneath the same crooked trees his grandfather had planted as a young man. Marcus stood beside him, in a suit that felt slightly out of place next to work boots and sun-cracked hands. "You could have just let it go," Marcus said, "taken the money and walked away." "I could have," Wendell agreed. But some things are worth more standing than they'd ever be worth cleared. Marcus looked out over the valley, the wells, the town in the distance, the trees, the quiet rise of grass now marked and honored instead of forgotten. I almost bulldozed all of it without knowing, he said, without ever knowing what was actually here. Most people would have, Wendell said. That's exactly why I ran in front of your excavator. He turned to leave, tapping his stick against the packed earth path, then paused and looked back one last time. Land doesn't ask for much, Mr. Bellamy. Just somebody willing to listen before they start digging. He walked on toward the tree line, disappearing for a moment into dappled shade and sunlight, and Marcus stood there a long while after, not thinking about spreadsheets, or timelines, or the $42 million that had brought him here in the first place, but about everything that had been standing quietly beneath his feet the whole time, waiting for someone to finally stop and listen.